We can start now, I think. Are we starting?
YouTube, sir. Otherwise, okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sahitya Academy's Webline Literature Series. Today's program is in English language. When any one dominant language which permeated the subcontinent, there were repercussions in many other languages. The influence, the impact of Persian or Sanskrit, or for that matter, English, is very well documented. But there has been extensive studies on the early Persian literature also. In fact, many people are wondering, when everything was documented probably towards the end of 18th or 19th century, early 19th century, people are astonished to discover that the amount of Persian literature produced in the subcontinent was much, much higher than that of that was at that time. During the medieval period, it was in the Persia or Mesopotamia, that region itself. The same way that the entry of English did quite a lot of things. I mean, it is very well known that many writers and the poets during the after 100 years after the entry of English as official language, they started trying to mimic some of the European ideas in their own language, whether it is Gujarati or Tamil or Hindi. So it is not something that has to be unexpected. But what was it like the early Indian English literature itself? So to discuss this and more, we have a very distinguished panel. To begin with, we will start. Our first participant is Professor Sumanyu Satpathy, and he was a former professor and chair Department of English at the University of Delhi, and he was a fellow Indian Institute IAS Shimla, and a distinguished fellow La Trobe University, Melbourne, and a visiting professor in several universities in India and abroad. The Will to Argue, Studies in Late Colonial and Post-Colonial Controversies is his most recent publication. Welcome to the show. Okay, he will join us later. And our next is Dr. Saptarishi Malik. He's an assistant professor. Just hold on. Radha Chakravati is joining us. And our next panelist is Dr. Saptarishi Malik. He's an assistant professor of English, Sukanta Mahavidyalaya, Jalpaiguri in Bengal. He's an associate professor. He's an associate editor of Gitanjali and Beyond, an international open access e-journal of the Scottish Centre for Tagore Studies, Edinburgh, Napier University. It's great to have you with us, Saptarishi. Yeah. And our third participant is Dr. Alka Singh. And Dr. Alka Singh is currently, she's a principal and professor of English at Basanta College for Women in Rajghat, Varanasi. She has been teaching for more than 3 decades and she has been a principal for the last 5-6 years. Her area of specialization is gender studies, subaltern studies, women writing, and contemporary literature in English. Oh, it's fantastic to have you, Dr. Alka Singh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And our next participant is Dr. Gargi Talapatra. She's an assistant professor in the Department of English, the Bhavanipur Education Society College in Kolkata. And she has a collection of poems entitled Pebbles Downstream. Some of her articles are found in the place in the some of the very important anthologies like William Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury. She wrote that for the American novel from Hawthorne to Heller, Cultural Context and Critical Perspectives, which was published last year. and the god of date palm trees and Panchi's sense organs. Again, she's translated that story into English, and it was published in the anthology Dalit Lekika, Women's Writing from Bengal. It was published again last year. So it's fantastic to have you with us, Professor Gargi. Okay, she will join us hopefully. And our next participant is Radha Chakravati, and she's a writer, critic, translator. She is co-editor The Essential Tagore, which is published by Harvard. And then, which was actually that was nominated for the Book of the Year in 2011. And then her works on Tagore include novelist Tagore, translations of Gora, Choker Bali. It's so many other things she has done on. She's actually a great Tagore scholar living amongst us. She's the author of Feminism and Contemporary Women Writers. She is nominated for Crossword Translation Prize in 2004 for In the Name of the Mother by Mahashweta Devi. She translated that, and she has also edited several anthologies of South Asian writing. Her poems have appeared in various collections. Forthcoming books include translations of Mahashweta Devi's memoirs and the essays of Qazi Nazrul Islam. She is a professor of comparative literature and translation studies at Ambedkar University. It's great to have you with us, Professor Radha Chakravati. Thank you. And today, to chair this symposium, we have with us Professor Rajul Bhargava, very senior writer and academician. And she has been teaching for publishing for last 45 years. And she has got a doctorate in sociology of literature, something which, well, it has gained currency nowadays. It's something which is very rare in India, at least. And she has received numerous fellowships and awards in a distinguished career. And many of her, she has been part of the things, one of the things that her contribution to the education in India is that she has served to not only form and also refine the curriculum in school and college levels. I think that is something which is very important. And she's a founder and editor of Voices and brings out biannual journal and organize roundtables under its aegis. And it's a welcome to the show, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now I request Professor Rajul to take over and conduct the proceedings. Thank you.
Right.
Rajul, it's yours.
Yes. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As we have just been told that this is a very interesting area. It's one of the areas in which the legacy was established, which we are now refining, and we are now trying to bring it up into the modern period with the postmodern aesthetics adjoining it. But whatever happened, if we look at it, it is a great archive. It is a great archive and archival site, as a matter of fact. It is a space that gives us not only historic visions, but also cultural visions. The writing from the early literature right till 1947, as has been now said, was really the root of whatever has today is today transpiring. So we have to look at it as a very intricate politics. Niches that the writers today hopefully will reveal are going to tell us how, you see, the whole edifice of literature, Indian writing in English, came into being and how it is now being strengthened. So I hope that the scholars that we have, a very distinguished panel, will uh, will take us on a bird's eye view and a worm's eye view of all the literary nuances that accumulate and today make us feel of how that is, although it was not, it came in spurts and bounces, but how it is a very, very valorizing influence. So with these few words, let us begin. And I think my first speaker for today is Dr. Alka Singh. Dr. Alka Singh, can
Yes.
we invite you to deliver your very interesting talk?
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. It is indeed a pleasure to be on a platform with such stalwarts with me. And I feel indeed humbled to make a small presentation of a certain area in which I have been trying to still find out as to what we can do in order to bring that to the fore. Having talked about my interest in things or subaltern literature or the marginal, I have been exploring the works of Rabindranath Tagore, and I came across short stories of his which somehow have failed to come to the forefront. And we are talking about literature till 1947. Now, Tagore is a name to reckon with, and we know him for his endless amount of work which he did in Bengali to be translated. But probably the last few short stories which he wrote in Bengali, of course, have still failed to be translated into English and other languages to be made available to the other writers who speak different languages. My intention being not only that these stories in a way help me to analyze a different psyche of Rabindranath Tagore, but also that it needs to be dealt with his sojourn as to what made him kind of be a little different to what he has done earlier. He is known as a Bengali polymath who has reshaped the Bengali literature, music, art, and of course, in contextual modernism. That is how we look at it today at his work. Being awarded the Nobel in 1930 as one of the first non-European persons in itself brought Gitanjali to the forefront. I would like to come to these narratives which are kind of ennobling, and it talks about the experience which one goes through in separation at the end of a man-woman relationship. Somehow the stories are very closely linked with each other. It could be one moving into the other. And basically in Bengali, as we have it, Teen Sangi, that is 1940 when it was published, that is probably as translated as the last three companions. To my surprise, it does not find its translated forms in English or in Hindi, but initially, when it was written, it did find its translation in certain papers, newspapers, leading newspapers of the time, from where I have, just found few sketches of it, and I'm still looking at it as to how I can get access to it. One story which was named by him Ravibar in this collection of three stories, and this came out probably in the Anand Bazar Patrika. It was translated and came out in English. Then it also came out in Hindustan, standard puja annual account, and laboratory again surfaced in the Anand Bazar. So these are three stories, Ravibar, Sheshkatha, and the laboratory, which still to us is available in his original language. To my understanding, the little that I understand out of these texts, which I have read through these bits of that translation here and there, as I understand it, it kind of moves Rabindranath Tagore on a different platform altogether, because the readership that he enjoys is definitely seeing these three stories as something probably marginal to what kind of work he had done. And this could be maybe of the latter years of his life in which this transition takes place. We can see this, that it is different in the method as well as the way he wants to interpret the reality of life, which he has been doing in many of his works earlier. Many people also, as I was going through the critics, seem to come to this opinion that basically it was an English reading public's impression of Rabindranath Tagore as a fiction writer, that it makes it very different, and the concerns also are kindly a little different from what he had been doing. N.K. Siddhanta, he had once described it as the speech of the educated and the cultured. And basically, this happens to be a culmination of a process which had begun more than 50 years ago for Rabindranath Tagore himself, who was writing Bangla prose suited to modern fiction, as I understand today. In these stories that we have before us, they are in keeping with the modernist turn of thought, and all three stories, we will find that there is one important male character, and that character on which Tagore had been working is also a scientist, because we have seen that Tagore was moving into science, into astronomy. So here we'll find there's a scientist, there's a technician, there is maybe a professor, which he is looking at. And we see that the three stories are centered on one exceptional woman as the protagonist in all of them. This protagonist is not one who can merely think for herself, but she works as a decisive manner to retain control of a relationship with the man in question. Now, this was slightly apart from what I had been understanding so far. And this female protagonist in all, but none were so independent or self-sufficient as the three characters that we see in these three stories emerging differently. Now, what is remarkable is what he had, the kind of character that he has created is he was kind of, as I understand, trying to give the women a greater autonomy over what their decisions were. And the structures reveal the spirit to tell you what it is all about. You know, to me, it seems possible, especially the third story is slightly long, and he was trying out the novella or the long story. But what I personally feel is that he could have developed this as a novel in itself, but somehow they have been retained as long stories. In the first story, as I see, we see shadows of earlier stories of Rabindranath Tagore, but that is not a credit, but the way they relate with each other. The character that is Alok Ranjan Dasgupta, who says there is unifying bond between the three parts, and any two parts can be regarded as subsidiaries of the remaining. So defining this, there is a close relationship that would not be easy to demonstrate unless we were to read the stories one after another together. We cannot get the impression as to why the author kept coming back to the characters. This Ravivar, which he says, that is Sunday, it basically deals with only 2 Sundays, the span between 2 Sundays, but it seems to be taking us into a very long span of time, and a lot of space is created in between that. And the major character, that is the lady Vibha, she refuses the proposal of Abhik simply because she feels that her father, whom she idealizes, that's again one common factor. where the father-daughter relationship has been explicated, that the father would be very unhappy if he were to know that she is going to marry this man, because he did not appreciate that. And Abhik's reply to that was that you want to spare someone pain who does not exist, is not a living person, and you are ready to plunge a dagger into someone who's alive, fresh blood, and in all desires to be in a relationship with you. Now she is very unhappy. She breaks down at 3 junctures in the text, and there are small dents. But the third time, when she feels the fear gets the better of her, she is actually, by then, Abhik has moved on. He has moved on in his life and he's far ahead of her. She goes to have some kind of a bonding with another character to whom she feels that her father would take to. Now, this kind of father-daughter relationship, which is explicated, although the father is not shown to be alive in the text, in itself is a kind of a challenge that has been taken, and she has to be on guard all the time against all such challenges which she means is demeaning. So therefore, Greek's aspiration actually to be an artist, whereas in contrast to the other gentleman, Amar Babu, who is basically wanting to be a scientist and a simple man, is more in close relationship to Vibha to the end of the text, although we only realize the turn of events from the letter that she receives from Abhik, who has played this game with her and also had the last say by sponsoring through wrong means and yet stealing her necklace. So what we see is that the kind of relationship which he's created here, and Vibha continues, is a kind of a different, when I just talked about an experience which is at the ultimate end between the separation of a man and woman. And the second story continues with this kind of text, which is Shesh Katha. That's the last word. And it begins by the narrator himself, who is introduced to us as Naveen Madhav, and he's a scientist here. In the first one, we had a technician. Here, he's a scientist. And obviously, he's trying to unearth, or he tries to go into some kind of a survey. And the transformation which has taken place in trying to identify the minerals probably has happened due to the fact that he was on a long stay abroad. And when he comes back, he brings in this kind of concept in terms of a patriotic fervor to realize that the discovery of the mineral resources that he is looking for was one way of building up the nation's capacity to sustain itself. Now, here in this forest where he comes to search, he finds this beautiful woman, and her name, which he has chosen, Rabindranath Tagore, Akira, comes from, of course, a Greek word meaning hand, but where it means that you can have a superimposed mirror image, scientific in itself in every way, and how it tries to draw on the character of this woman, the very name itself. Now, this gentleman, Nabeen, comes to know of her. He kind of takes to her gradually, but what happens is that he learns that she is not willing to accept this relationship due to the fear that is in her mind, for she already had been kind of betrayed by a previous relationship which had brought a lot of shame to her father. And obviously then the father had taken refuge and taken VRS and stayed in the forest because he did not want, because that people should know that this gentleman whom he had helped with this marriage will obviously not going to stay with his daughter and move on in life. So therefore she is very kind of strongly against it, and she goes on to tell Naveen Badhu, although she likes him, but she says she is not going to indulge, because the fact is that it may lead to another failure of hers which might be detrimental to her father. And here at this stage, he accepts the verdict. The male protagonist, he accepts it, and he tells her, he says, see, my story concludes here. What remains is a geologist's account. Being a geologist, he says, what remains is that. And it is here that I shall find solace in what I am doing. But he says, as soon as he moves out, that it is like a fetter that remains on his legs and makes clanking noises with any movement, a reminder of the kind of affiliation and the sorrow that it had brought to him. The interesting feature is that the analogy of the geological research fits his aspirations as a scientist come patriot. We can find a kind of a relationship there. And the search here is for minerals as a process of self-discovery, which may lead to other positive actions. That is how, I am looking at his profession and his relationship that seem to be overlapping each other. Now here, this story is a first-person narrative. So it remains open to speculation because we really do not know whether what he is narrating, is it the actual thought of Akira or is it a manipulative concept? But it falls much more stronger than the first story, which was a third-person narration, because here you'll see that describing the feelings of this lady, Akira, he says, now and then the monstrous night takes possession of me and I become aware of the demons of desire that could snatch me from my grandfather. So what we see here is that the fear that about her that he talks about seems as though she is giving in mentally to the desires and yet restraining herself so that she can be kind of in agreement to what her father's reputation was all about. And the third story is about self-reliance, which is also projected in the story Laboratory. And this title also has been set up in a science students background. And we see here the one unique character is that the leading lady, who is Sohini, is not a Bengali, but a Punjabi girl who has been picked up by this gentleman who was looking after a laboratory and found that she was good enough to pick up, although it is believed or rather subtly stated that she could have been a part-time substitute when he found her. But Nand Kishore's wife feels that her husband has picked on her and that she would do justice to his desires. And why does the wife appreciate Nand Kishore's attempt is not because he's learned, but because he kind of has reverence for learning, which looks for no reward. That is what it culminates in. So what we see in these three stories is basically a kind of understanding, not the scientists of the story, but the women, the way they act and react with who live in our minds long after once we have finished reading the stories. And they kind of invite a place of honor and in the whole gallery of women characters, and which he has drawn in his poetry, plays, novels, and stories. All three characters, Vibha, Akira, and Sohini, they are kind of probably the last three companions that Rabindranath has in his mind, or maybe the last three companions that were there with him just when he was about to wind up. And this reminds me of his line from Gitanjali, which says, when I go from hence, let this be my parting word, that what I have seen is unsurpassable. The effort here in trying to project these stories or trying to talk about it is because somehow they need to be looked at, to be studied and researched as to what was in the mind of Tagore in writing these three stories, but have not found, translation and reach among the masses. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
listening to me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for keeping the time. I think we can have the questions
Later,
now.
later, ma'am.
Later,
Yeah.
absolutely later. So
Thank you so
we
much.
can,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you so much, Alka ji. That was a very beautiful analysis of the three stories, taking into point the Tagore's views on women and how they are exceptional and how they are in a kind of an autonomy of their own. Now, can we go on to Gargi Talapatre, the next speaker for today's webinar? Gargi ji?
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah,
Yes.
please.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, Sahitya Academy, for this wonderful opportunity to be on the panel with such distinguished academicians and speakers. I am humbled and I take this opportunity to present my paper, my thoughts on 19th century Indian English literature with reference to the literary osmosis which was continuously taking place at this point of time. To my reading and understanding of 19th century Indian English literature, I think there was a continuous dialogue that Indian English was engaging in with the vernacular languages of the period, and hence my paper is on 19th century Indian English literature and the process of literary osmosis, a brief overview. I begin. Indian English literature, as we trace its origin and development through the 19th and 20th centuries, emerges as a socially, culturally, and politically informed area of literary activity, practiced in an acquired language within the geospatial context of a multilingual country called India. The fact that it is written in an acquired language almost automatically implies a distinct readership and sometimes a distinct purpose. Hence, any evaluation or study of early Indian English literature demands a continuous mapping of the social, cultural, and political osmosis which shaped thought and literary expressions during this period, along with an assessment of aesthetic merit. The earliest Indian writing in English is said to have been that by Sheikh Deen Muhammad, the Indian traveler, surgeon, and entrepreneur who immigrated to Ireland in 1784. He is credited with having introduced Indian cuisine and shampoo baths to Europe, and he published his book called The Travels of Deen Muhammad in 1794. Written in the form of an epistolary travel narrative and published from Ireland during the peak of English Romanticism, Deen Muhammad inspires wonder as one reads through his descriptions of the different cultures and societies of North India, intended to represent India in totality to the European reader. However, it is seldom taken into account while considering Indian English literature, perhaps because it was written by an Indian immigrant in Europe, and the travelogue did not actually emerge on the Indian soil amidst the colonial context of contemporary India. The first 2 decades of the 19th century in India are marked by a number of socio-cultural and political changes. For instance, the Fort William College was established in Kolkata as a center for Oriental studies in 1800. While on the one hand, this period saw a large-scale establishment of printing press in various vernacular languages across the nation, such as the Sirampur Mission and Press, 1800, the Hindustani Press, 1801, the Sanskrit Yantra, 1807, and the Gujarati Printing Press, 1812. On the other hand, it was also a period of continuous translations from English into the vernacular languages. Apart from the New Testament, which was translated into Bengali, Marathi, Odia, and Sanskrit during this time, translations of the Aeneid and, interestingly, the Pilgrim's Progress were also widespread. Hence, literary and cultural osmosis was already an established norm. From the political perspective, The early 19th century was again a turbulent phase, comprising uprisings and continuous acts of resistance against the British rule, such as the Anglo-Maratha War in 1803, the Velour Mutiny in 1806, the Siege of Bharatpur in 1805, the Pike Rebellion in 1817, and the defeat of Queen Chennamma of Kittur in Karnataka in 1824. Against this backdrop of a simultaneous process of contrasting aspects in the form of assimilation as well as resistance, through the first half of the 19th century, one would notice a particular change in the social fabric constituting Indianness, which is manifested in the Indian English writings of this period. A well-known example of this national and cultural consciousness as well as literary osmosis may be seen in Derosio's poem, To India, My Native Land. Published in The Fakir of Janghira, A Metrical Tale and Other Poems, 1828, the poem laments the past glory of India, as the poet who claims himself to be her minstrel has, and I quote, "no wreath to weave for thee save the sad story of thy misery," unquote. The poem concludes with the promise of a revival of historical and cultural consciousness in order to break away from the hegemonic subjugation of the nation at the hands of the British rule. It is interesting here to see the hybridity of form and content. The poem is written in the form of a Petrarchan sonnet with an octave and a sestet. So literary convention followed here is clearly European, but the sensitivity is Indian. Hence, a curious process of assimilation as well as resistance is discernible in the earliest writings of Indian English literature. A major historical development shaping the future course of Indian English literature at this stage was the establishment of the Hindu College in Kolkata in 1817, which provided the first ever platform for English as a medium of education for the Indians. An interesting work, which is a direct offshoot of this development, is a journal of 48 hours of the year 1945 written by Kailash Chandra Dutt. It was intended for primarily an English or English educated elitist readership and published in the Calcutta Literary Gazette, Volume 3 in 1835. Incidentally, it coincides with the year of Macaulay's Minutes on Education. Dealing with an imaginary resistance against the British rule as its subject matter, Dutt's journal provides a vivid description of an attack on Fort William by the natives under the leadership of the hero Bhuban Mohan. The narrative ends with a final defeat of the natives and the death of the protagonist at the scaffold. The work is replete with the influence of English Romantic literature in its description of nature, its characterization, its visualization of the battle scenes, and its dream of transcendence. However, though distant, one can already see here a sense of nation evolving, a subjugated nation seeking freedom from foreign rule. This permeating romanticism found a more prominent expression in the works of Michael Madhusudhan Dutt. Dutt's initial poems written in English, such as The Captive Lady, bear a mark of pronounced influence of English literary conventions. However, what is significant is that the Indian English writer at this juncture becomes himself a source of confluence of the vernacular language and English literature. Dutt's later works in Bengali represent this unique blend, and they stand as examples of this literary osmosis prevalent during the 19th century. Hence, Indian writing in English by the mid-19th century was no longer an isolated domain exclusive to the tradition of a foreign language introduced by the colonizer. It demanded recognition as a channel of cultural and literary confluence. For the literary history of Indian English in the 19th century is in a state of continuous interaction and dialogue with the literary histories of the other Indian languages. The year 1857 marked a major transition in Indian English writing. as also for the literature in other vernacular languages. This year saw the establishment of the 3 universities in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras as centers of higher education inspired by the British vision of native education and seeking to encourage the cultivation of the vernacular languages of India. It was also the year of the uprising of 1857, which, whether or not it gained public consent, did leave a deep impact on the emerging consciousness of India as a nation. Therefore, as one reaches Rajmohan's Wife, 1864, the only novel written by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay in English, which is also considered the first Indian English novel, one witnesses a paradigm shift in thought and expression from the earlier Indian English literature. This novel, which apparently presents a glimpse of domestic life in rural Bengal, also introduces into the discursive domains of literary studies in Indian English the concepts of a nationalist vision, negotiations between tradition and modernity, and a reconstruction of colonial subjecthood from the perspective of an English-educated native. Unlike Derozio, Kailash Chandra Dutt, or later Michael Madhusudan Dutt, Bankim Chandra's conceptualization of the nation is not a romantic reverie steeped in distant cultural myths. His nation is woven into the real lives of men and women of his times. Later, in the works of Toru Dutt, one finds the resonance of English Romanticism distinctly once again. However, compared to her predecessors, the poetry of Toru Dutt is much more rooted in a cultural consciousness which is very Indian. In her book entitled Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan, published posthumously in 1882, the first section entirely comprises poems composed about the legendary characters of the Hindu mythology, such as Savitri, Lakshman, Sita, Prahlad, and Dhruva. Though the prominent Dutt family was thoroughly anglicized and embraced Christianity, against the larger backdrop of 19th century Indian English literature, the poems by Toru Dutt stand as markers of a shifting literary vision. As English, despite being the medium of literary expression here, is appropriated to present to the readers a sense of rootedness which is no longer merely British. It now bears the distinct quality of being Indian English, which voices the cultural and historical reflections of the colonized. Though the form remains closer to the English literary conventions, the content is closer to the Indian soil. Shishir Kumar Das, in his History of Indian Literature, observes that, and I quote, "The problem that confronted the 19th century Indian intellectual was how to keep English, a language of power, separate from English, the language of the ruling power." Unquote. This, however, was a problem which would acquire new shades of complexity with passing time. With the gradually rising Western impact upon vernacular literatures, through a continuous process of literary osmosis, political articulations had begun taking shape to construct a new discourse of the nation and the self in the Indian literatures in English as well as the vernacular languages. It was this nationalist consciousness which would permeate Indian writing in English, leading it to attain a new dimension towards the end of the 19th century. A glimpse of this may be found in the early poetry of Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, written during the last decade of the 19th century. In a poem called Lines on Ireland, written in 1896, Sri Aurobindo writes of England thus, I quote, "Forever thus preparing nemesis, in ruling nations unjust power has borne insolence, injustice, madness, outrage, scorn." Unquote. What is clearly discernible here is a transition in terms of literary sensibility, form, as well as content. Though the language is still Indian English, the poem is no longer a mere imitation of English literary traditions. It has acquired the edge to critique and interrogate the colonizer through a language which is now transplanted to the Indian consciousness. It is politically informed, socially aware, and colored by an unmistakable identity of the evolving Indianness. Early Indian English literature, hence, cannot be comprehended as an isolated narrative of literary evolution. It is in its continuous interactions with the people and the vernacular languages that Indian English undergoes a gradual transformation and a kind of cultural transplantation to emerge as distinctly Indian through the 19th century. From an acquired foreign language introduced for administrative reasons, Indian English by the end of the 19th century emerges as a language of communication between the educated classes of a multilingual nation, and also an intermediate language facilitating translations from one Indian language into another. It is through these stages of development that Indian English becomes a language of Indian articulation and emerges as a medium of more mature and channelized expressions of the 20th century. In fact, Sarojini Naidu's The Golden Threshold, published in 1905, might be interpreted as a metaphor marking the journey of Indian English itself as it crosses the threshold of its origin to assimilate a new cultural and historical consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a very beautifully illustrative chronology, as well as of how we have evolved from an accepted to an assimilative position. You rightly have said that this is a osmotic journey, and you have narrated how the osmosis has grown into what we call Indian English writing today. Thank you very much, Gargi. Yeah. Now can we move on to the next speaker, Radha Chakravati.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Sahitya Akademi for giving me this opportunity to speak on, I think, what is a very significant subject in more than just a literary way. My presentation actually follows naturally from what has just gone before, the wonderful presentation by Gargi Tarpatra, because we have just heard this wonderful overview of how English interacted with indigenous traditions in the 19th century. My presentation is on the English Tagore and world literature. So it kind of follows on from the prehistory that we've just been given. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, Gaigi-ji. So I will here, it's not so much an overview of all the things that Tagore wrote in English, but it's really an argument about how Tagore wrote in English in a way that placed Indian writing, South Asian writing on the world literary map, and the way in which he attempted to bridge the distance between the local and the global. While Rabindranath Tagore was not the first Indian writer to experiment with creative writing in English, he certainly played a major role in placing Indian writing in English on the map of world literature when he became the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. Here, I examine the English writings of Tagore in relation to the evolving discourse of world literature to argue that his example remains significant for current theorizations of world literature today. I also argue for the need to situate his English writings in a way that compels us to look beyond the Western stereotype of Tagore as the mystical wise man from the East and the Bengali adulation of him as the sanctified Gurudev in order to draw attention to his extraordinary complexity and versatility. We have just heard how before Tagore, numerous literary luminaries such as Kailash Chandra Dutt, De Rosio, Bankim, Toru Dutt, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, Aurobindo Ghosh, etc., had already set the stage for the rise of the category that we today call IWE, Indian Writing in English. As a result of the colonial encounter and the spread of English education, Bengal had become a fertile ground for transcultural and translingual experiments that placed indigenous literary traditions in a volatile relationship with the cultures of the West. Tagore's writings in English need to be read in the context of this local cultural ethos and also in relation to the conditions of his own upbringing in a liberal, syncretic home environment where it was the custom to embrace multiple cultural and linguistic traditions in an eclectic spirit. Early in life, he tried translating Shakespeare and several other English poets into Bengali. During his maiden visit to England at 17, he was fascinated by the lectures on English literature that he heard there in the university atmosphere. But it was in his 50s, with Gitanjali, Sadhana, and the religion of man, that his English writings took the world by storm. Subsequently, his reputation fluctuated and declined, but many of his English works continue to be read today, and they remain of historic importance for their path-breaking role in the emergence of IWE in the global domain. The English writings of Tagore are quite voluminous, as we can see from the 4 large volumes edited by Shishir Kumar Das and Nityapriya Ghosh and published by Sahitya Akademi. These writings, running to more than 3,200 pages, comprise poetry, fiction, plays, essays, lectures, letters, and other miscellaneous writings. Some important works in English that we all know of are just a few examples: Gitanjali, Fruit Gathering, Nationalism, The Child, Red Oleanders, The Waterfall, Creative University, Personality, and the short but important educational piece, The Parrot's Training. Many are translations and rewritings of his own Bengali texts. Some are collaborative translations. Taken together, they constitute a formidable body of work, signaling Tagore's serious engagement with the English language. The appearance of Gitanjali brought accolades from major literary figures like Yeats and Ezra Pound. When Tagore's anthology Hungry Stones and Other Stories appeared in 1916, a British reviewer in The Nation exclaimed, and I'm quoting, "The real discovery of India may come from such work as this. If there are more novels and tales of this quality in the Indian vernaculars, the translation of them would be the greatest of all steps towards a comprehension by the West of the East." Yet, Tagore was not confident about his own command of English. In a letter to Edward Thompson, he says, and I quote, "In my translations, I timidly avoid all difficulties, which has the effect of making them smooth and thin. I know I'm misrepresenting myself to the Western reader." In his own translations, he often tries to please his Western audience by diluting the cultural specificity of the Bengali originals. Edward Thompson complains, more and more he toned down or omitted whatever seemed to him characteristically Indian, which very often was what was gripping and powerful. He despaired too much of ever persuading our people to be interested in what was strange to them. As Tagore became busy with his travels and lecture schedules, he began to leave the task of translating his works to friends and associates whose competence was questionable. And so it has been pointed out that the ill-judged selection of translators and unevenness of translation styles conveyed little of the vigor and beauty of his Bengali stories and his experiments with Bengali prosody. Tagore acknowledges the cracks and gaps, this is his own phrase, the cracks and gaps in his translations, and declares, and I quote, "I have come to the conclusion that translating a poem is doing it wrong, especially when the original belongs to a language which is wholly alien to the medium of its translation." About his own English translations is quite diffident. He says, "I've come to the conclusion that I have done gross injustice to my original productions, partly owing to my incompetence and partly to carelessness. I should have to rely upon my English friends for the revision, for I never can trust my own English." But despite this diffidence, he continued to write in English, for his efforts to communicate in an alien tongue were part of his broad, inclusive vision of a heterogeneous, multilingual world beyond the narrow boundaries of parochialism. Some of Tagore's English stories demand a re-examination of the popular stereotypes of Tagore abroad and in India. They express, for instance, a sharp social awareness that contradicts the image of Tagore as the mystic poet, the wise man from the East. And we've already had this wonderful paper from Dr. Alka Singh about his late stories and how powerful they are. The Parrot's Training and The Patriot, for instance, are witty satirical works, and Giribala is a satirical critique of a male-dominated society. And these are stories that he rewrote himself, they're kind of self-translations into English. The Parrot's Training is a satire on the practice of learning by rote. Tagore had always been averse to the ritualistic, lifeless education systems and had expressed his views openly in essays and lectures. But feeling that it was not enough to say these things in Bengali, he took up the English translation of this work and had the book printed and sent it out to many of his acquaintances. The Parrot's Training is thus an instance of translation as activism inspired by a transformative impulse. So he was writing in English to change the existing system of education, and he saw his writing in English in that way. In political terms, his English writings need to be read in relation to Tagore's views on the limits of nationalism and the need for a new internationalism that would not be driven by imperialist power formations. Philosophically, these writings may be connected to his entire worldview based on a profound awareness of the interconnectedness of all things in the universe. In sociocultural terms, Tagore's works in English, when read in the context of his whole oeuvre and the cultural climate of 19th century Bengal, represent the recognition of the need for a new transformative modernity that would simultaneously draw upon indigenous traditions and elements drawn from other cultures. The English writings of Tagore perform multiple boundary crossings. They create a space for intercultural dialogue where differences can be negotiated and heterogeneities acknowledged. Here, translation and writing in a different tongue become not merely a linguistic exercise, but an active attempt to imagine into being a diverse community of imagined readers. For the English writings address not only the non-Bengali readers in South Asia, but also a wider audience abroad. Given that Tagore was a world traveler, these writings can also be read as a mode of communication with a large and heterogeneous audience from different parts of the globe. In an important way, these writings connect with Tagore's articulation of his own idea of world literature. When asked to deliver a lecture on comparative literature at the Jatiya Shiksha Parishad, or the National Council for Education, in 1907, Tagore coined the term Vishwa Sahitya. For him, comparative literature was not adequate as a term. He preferred the term Vishwa Sahitya. For him, world literature is grounded in a broad humanism that transcends geographical boundaries. And in this essay, he says, Just as this earth is not the sum of patches of land belonging to different people, and to know the earth as such is sheer rusticity, so literature is not the mere total of works composed by different hands. From this narrow provincialism, we must free ourselves, he insists. We must strive to see the work of each author as a whole, that whole as a part of man's universal creativity, and that universal spirit in its manifestations through world literature. Tagore emphasizes the idea of universality and the need for an inclusive vision that can rise above the narrow, circumscribed spheres of the local and the immediate. He says, again in the same essay, man throughout the whole of history is incessantly at work to fulfill his deepest purposes and to unite himself with the all. Likewise, what really claims our attention in world literature is the way in which the soul of man expresses its joy. Elsewhere in his writings, though, Tagore also celebrates the minute and the particular, expressing a comprehensive vision in which the same spirit that animates the cosmos finds its manifestation in the atomic, concrete details of our particular individual lives. In Gitanjali, for instance, he writes, and I quote, "The same stream of life that runs through my veins night and day runs through the world and dances in rhythmic measures." Tagore's vision affirms the dynamic link between all things great and small. There is also a strong ethical component in this perspective. In these ideas of connectedness and constant movement, framed within an all-encompassing humanism, can we find a paradigm for a new world literature? In this paradigm, what role can language and translation play? In some important respects, Tagore's idea of Vishwa Sahitya is directly at odds with the ways in which the term world literature is currently understood in mainstream Western academia. In these debates, the scholarly voices, as well as the bodies of literature that take center stage, reflect the continued dominance of the global north in the shaping of literary discourse. The term world literature, in the sense that has gained currency in academic discourse, is taken as proof that we live in a small world with a globalized culture. We can detect in this model of world literature the persistence of the 19th century ideology of the nation state, with even greater emphasis on the surveillance and management of borders. In contrast, Tagore's vision of world literature draws on Asian traditions. Speaking of Sahitya, he speaks of Vishwa Sahitya, pointing out that Sahitya in our languages is different from literature in English, because literature has to do with literacy, whereas Sahitya is rooted in the source word Sahit. Excuse me. Sorry, my phone is sorry. He speaks of Sahitya as a term rooted in the source word Sahit, which implies being with or together. In the field of comparative literature, debates about world literature tend to be driven by questions of power and the dominance of some languages and cultures over others. Tagore's model overthrows this paradigm by suggesting coexistence and collaboration without erasure of differences. His English writings, in this sense, can be seen as an intervention in the discourse of world literature, placing South Asian writing on the world stage via translation and staking a claim to the domain of the transnational without erasing the presence of the local and the regional. These writings do not achieve a perfect balance between the local and the global. And in the first part of my paper, you heard what Tagore himself said about his own awareness of the limitations of his attempts to publish in English. In the transmission and reception of these texts in English, the fault lines between regional and international perspectives cannot be concealed. So things don't blend seamlessly and merge in a harmonious way all the time. Tagore was aware of this dual pull within him. He sought an international audience and cared about his reputation abroad, yet the cultural differences between his world and that of his Western readers could not be erased. But it is precisely the tension between these different impulses in Tagore's writing that invites our scrutiny to open up for us alternative ways to think about debates on world literature in our own contemporary world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Radha Chakravati. That indeed was a specification of the generalized that Gargi had said just before you, and how beautifully you have tried to sum up the whole of Tagore's ideology regarding language, regarding translation, regarding the local and the culture, the mixing of the two, but how Tagore was diffident of diluting the cultural things, and most specifically, very specifically indeed, the whole concept of Vishwa Sahitya that was given by Tagore. Thank you so very much. And now we move on to Saptarshi Malik. Saptarshi, can we invite you to present your paper now?
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm grateful to Sahitya Akademi for extending to me this wonderful opportunity. I'm thoroughly humbled amidst everyone who have been here enriching us this afternoon. And before I start my presentation, thank you, Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta, for being there for us always. Well, my presentation will be on Rajmohan's wife, and I'm going to explore give my brief observations regarding this particular text in the context of the nation and the treatment of the woman. So I begin my presentation. Nation is a cultural construct which is based on several factors and discourses, and early generation post-colonial writers were conscious of their role and contribution towards the development of the nation. The novel, historically and culturally, has played a significant role in the development of this discourse, as the novel has objectified the multiple and consolidated the national existence as a geographical, historical, cultural dimensions address the concept of nation in post-colonial literature, where the Western constructions of the nations are not only interrogated by the post-colonial writers, but they also aim to redefine and reconstruct the nation to the frames of its history, culture, and other factors which collectively create the nation in the post-colonial perspective through post-colonial methodologies, rhetorical forms, and epistemologies where trauma, pride, and hope assimilate through the complex dynamics of representation and discourse. The marginal, as for example, the spirit of Indian nationalism for the West, has often been central and foundational in the non-West, and post-colonialism interrogates the Western tendency to stereotype the non-Western knowledge and culture as the erstwhile other in the context of the normative self of Western history, epistemology, and rationality. Indian nationalism, as evoked by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, further bore the imprint of 19th century British education. As the novelists were dealing with burning issues related to the independence in the creative works, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay drew upon a repertoire of received myths and symbols, attempting to overhaul traditional icons from the perspective of British rationalism. Chattopadhyay adopted the English language to depict in a realistic vein the life story of East Bengal middle class people in his first novel, Rajmohan's Wife, which was written in the English language, and it was serialized in 1864 in the short-lived weekly magazine, The Indian Field, published from Calcutta. The novel therefore presents a true-to-life account of the middle class in Bengal and life in the rural villages, with special emphasis on conjugality, where a mimetic rendering of domestic life in fiction or weaving of the plot out of contemporary social and familial situations have been undertaken, making it to be the first Indian English novel. This novel therefore becomes a space which weaves issues related to the creation of nation space in the context of property, legal issues, crime, and colonial administration, juxtaposed with an elaborate description about the claustrophobic existence of women surpassed by Matungini, the wife of Rajmohan, to a certain extent, the Nora Helmer of this novel. Rajmohan's wife registers a subtle shift in the venue of colonial discourse from the public to the private sphere through an intricate association of the home and the world. It at once establishes Bomkim's initial success in exploring the romance mode through a realistic presentation of the contemporary Bengali life, modified, no doubt, by the pulls of other narrative traditions. We have the influence of Sanskrit Kavya, we have the influence of Gothic novel. Rajmohan's wife sows the seeds of thoughts, observations, and ideas which get appropriated later in his subsequent novels, written in the Bengali language, where the narrative depicts realism, contemporary life, the stealing of the will in Krishna Kante's will. We have extramarital passion in Brishabhikho, female initiative in Indira, childhood attachment growing into adolescent love in Chandrasekhar. Matungini, that is, she's Rajmohan's wife, the revolutionary protagonist of this particular novel by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, emerges as emerging Indian nationalism. The novel's title presents Matungini only in her limited domestic capacity as a wife of Rajmohan. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay seems to deny her autonomy as well as her complete identity, identifying her as someone else's wife through her husband, alike the country struggling towards freedom under the imperial rule of the British. Yet, Matungini emerges as a new nation with all her spirit, energy, and strength alien to her surroundings, society stigmatized by conventions and superstitions. Matungini's actions betray a spirit of greater vitality and unwillingness to be confined by tradition, an individual who is created from an amalgam of classical, medieval, and European sources and a totally unprecedented imaginative leap into what might constitute a new female subjectivity as a memorable character. Matungini therefore personifies an emergent India that is modern and tradition-bound. The India of Matungini can neither be confined by the custodians of past, nor it can be sustained or liberated by either the British or the British-educated Bengali elite, represented by the figure of Madhav, whose refinement is the result of the English education he received at Calcutta, which promised to young men with money, often making them patrons of new liberal humanist ethos of the education in the English language. The question of India's fate, instead of being strategically hushed down in the novel by the portrayal of an uncertain future of the spirited Matungini, who, like Madhav, represents the true spirit of future India, which was still under the threat of the colonial power. It is difficult to capture the real contours of Indian nationalism, just as it is hard to gauge the real woman in Matungini, whom though Chattopadhyay describes as the perfect flower of beauty, but she possesses the powerful force of goddesses Kali, which is the meaning of her name, evident through her boldness and ability to rise up against the patriarchal domination of her husband, the innocent village bride, the passionate lover, the loving sister, the sufferer, and the transgressor. All these identities run into one another, as if to venerate the very ambiguity that befits her central status in Chattopadhyay's allegorical narrative. Matungini's emotional relationships determine the courage of the novel, with conflict and pain like the one we generally have in the epics, that suffering is a law of humanity. An allegorical reading of Chattopadhyay's Rajmohan's Wife paves new avenues not only for the historicist, but also for feminist scholars reviewing the periods of women's contribution to Indian nationalism. Matungini inhabits a pre-Swadeshi Bengali domestic space, and clearly, if she is to enter the nationalist discourse at all, she is to be judged as a symbol rather than an active participant in the freedom movement. Apart from Rajmohan, she is also the object of desire for Mathur, which is at an allegorical study reflects India to be a space where several forces contend to prove their respective supremacy. In fact, the creation of the symbol or the myth of the nation as a woman was one of the most prolific projects of the 19th century Bengali nationalism. In Rajmohan's Wife, Chattopadhyay attempts to create an icon of both ethnicity and modernity, and by doing so, creates avenues for new standards of representation in the nationalist discourse. Instead of making his heroine a feminized symbol in a predominantly male narrative, he allows her a space for independent decisions and actions. The radical Matungini does not kowtow to patriarchal expectations. She is first the series of a strong and transgressive women in the author's novels who will eventually be punished for breaking the silence and going beyond the constructed boundaries in spite of the author and the readers admiring them for their fiery spirit. She rather embraces the very challenges of the outside world that lead her to an obscure end when she wants to leave everyone to go to her father. The novel's very incompleteness leaves it open-ended. Chattopadhyay's women are different in nature. They stand in confrontation with their husbands if they violate any moral or social code. In Kopal Kundula, Durgeshi Nandini, Mrinalini, Chandrasekhar, Devi Chaudhurani, Indira, Rajani, Vrishabhikko, everywhere, Bankim has been ardent in attempting for female emancipation in the Indian times. His women are never stereotyped. They are never subjected to patriarchal politics in a discursive way, but they stand out to pursue a room of their own. Matungini is the first in the series of strong and transgressive women. We have the others like Aisha, Rohini, Shoibalini. They're all rising up together to fight against the patriarchal system imposed against them. The name Matungini itself derives from Durga or Kali in one of her avatars. And Mathur, who abuses the real Matungini, thus propitiates her dead symbol. Here we observe a Janus-like portrayal of nationalism with its separate treatments of the female as a national icon and the female as a real person. In contrast to Mathur, we have another character, Madhav, whose refinement may be the result of his exposure to the new liberal humanist ethos of the English education he received in Calcutta. The British legal system is not able to address Matungini's grievances. This unquestioning faith in colonial justice surfaces only very intermittently in the 19th century Bangla fiction, as in Tagore's short story Didi, deftly analyzed by Spivak. But more often than not, British rule is perceived as oppressive and exploitative, and certainly nowhere in Chattopadhyay's Bangla corpus do we find the justice and efficiency of imperial rule so unequivocally, if briefly proclaimed, as in the solitary English novel Rajmohan's Wife. The issues of representation bring us back to the question of the real woman and the iconic woman in Matungini. Chattopadhyay, even while dissecting across the issue of the female representation on nationalist discourse, shows a leaning towards some tenets of the discourse itself, especially in the characterization of his protagonist. Matungini stepping out of the home, her breaching of the Lakshman Rekha of domesticity, is regarded by the author as an act of love and sacrifice. She thus rises up against the deep-rooted binaries of society and is able to interrogate the stereotypes imposed upon her. By making Matungini confess her love for her brother-in-law, the author has pushed her into an uncharted and ambiguous territory from which neither romantic sympathy nor colonial justice can deliver her to a positive future. When Matungini confronts Madhav with her passion, all he can do is to weep and implore her to forget him. It is at this point we see that there is a clash and coalescence of both the Eastern and Western values. It is for this reason Professor Meenakshi Mukherjee, in her essay in The Perishable Empire, states that Matungini poses a problem because the author towards the end tries to bring about the conventions of the British Victorian novel. Unlike the married Lavangalata, Matungini voices her love for her brother-in-law with a passionate abandon, which develop the ethnicity of Matungini on two different templates: the icon of Sita and Radha as a self-sacrificing Hindu woman, and those of Kali or Durga as an embodiment of an awe-invoking Shakti are both vested in a single character. In the course of her solitary journey in the dark night through forest, water, storm, and lightning to Madhav's house, Matangini becomes at one with Radha of the Obhishara Parva of Vaishnapadaboli and Uma of Kalidas's Kumarasambhava. Throughout the novel, Matangini features as an image of Shakti, which is both protective and punitive as in Durga, or erotically destructive as in Kali. The real and the iconic develop and get superimposed upon each other up to a certain point in the novel, but not till the end, where Matangini is at last stripped of her power image and partially punished for her transgression as a common woman. So we wonder the meeting point of the iconic and the real, as for another instance, the innocent Dayamoi in Prabhat Kumar Mukhopadhyay's Devi loses her mind in the clash of the divine and the real identities. Matangini too, in spite of being illuminated as a character, as I'm quoting Professor Meenakshi Mukherjee, whose spirit is otherwise indomitable, is finally pushed in a limbo. Though Matangini is made up of heterogeneous elements and her actions are not either confined within the portals of time and space, yet Chattopadhyay does not enable her to be a complete icon of female empowerment, but a partial one, that of Indian woman in making. The radical Matangini paves the way for the new woman like Aisha, Bimala, Kapalakundala, Moti Bibi, Shanti. They're all cutting across the prevalent conventional portrayal of love scenes in Indian literature. The identity of women in Chattopadhyay, as is evident from these portrayals, unfold the spirit of an age and a society aiming towards an enlightenment through its steady embrasure of traditional icons. I quote from Tagore's Personality: "Life should be like a lamp where the potentiality of light is far greater in quantity than what appears as a flame. It is in the depth of passiveness in woman's nature that this potentiality of life is stored." Chattopadhyay was able to combine the issues of 19th century Western Enlightenment and 19th century internationalism into dynamic artistic canvas. And in this respect, his pen excelled undoubtedly in the depiction of women, cutting across the boundaries of gender, race, and religion to add new dimensions to the ever-emerging character of internationalism, as the ideal of stability is deeply cherished in woman's nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Saptarishi Malik. This was a very, very beautiful and a very enlightening depiction of Matangini, of how between the iconic and the real, she traverses grounds that are unprecedented, that have been not very efficiently recorded in literature. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. Can we now move on to Professor Subramaniu Satpathy, our last speaker for today's series? Professor Subramaniu Satpathy.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here, within the confines of the COVID scare. Finally, we are able to see people at far off places through the digital medium. And thank you, Sahitya Akademi. My paper is actually extracted from a longer work in progress that I return to off and on. And though it's part of the larger theme of today's symposium, it's limited to early Indian poetry in English. So in a way, this is a bit different from the other presentations, and it's also in the nature of what one might call meta criticism, because I do not engage in any analysis of the body of writing called early Indian poetry in English, but I look at the way it has been looked at by others. So the title of my paper today is Narrativizing Early Indian Poetry in English, 1827 to 1876. So I'm not coming up to 1940s. What I'm trying to do here is to look at how the entire history of Indian poetry in English, particularly early Indian poetry in English, has been recounted. And as we notice, most accounts of early Indian English poetry tend to start by dismissing the entire body of writing that the term describes, from the works of Henry de Rosio to that of Toru Dutt and beyond, maybe up to Sarojini Naidu even. Sometimes the more sympathetic accounts too end up being merely condescending towards them. As Eunice D'Souza, in her introduction to the Anthology of Indian English Poetry, early Indian English Poetry, which was published in 2005, says, and I quote her from her introduction, "It is time to stop uh, gently patting these early writers on the back, to stop patronizing them by suggesting they cannot be assessed in literary terms," unquote. Unfortunately, Ines D'Souza herself does little else in her introduction. Further, even while discussing modern Indian English poetry in the post-Nissim Ezekiel era, these poet critics must begin by denigrating their predecessors. The complaints ranging from the poets being too imitative of the English Romantic or Victorian poets to not being bold enough in their subject, its treatment, or the idiom, and so on. Those few intrepid souls who embark on the project of either defending the early bands or analyzing them, they themselves begin by quoting the objections of detractors, but seldom, if at all, operate beyond identical aesthetic parameters, circumambulating as they do without breaking any new grounds. It is painful to read these accounts, and one cannot help feeling a sense of deja vu. It is my contention here, humble contention here, that literary historians of the period, especially of the very early Indian English poetry, suffer from a lack of theoretical analytical tools and therefore do less than justice to their own projected task. Of course, this is accepting the presentations we have just had, and there have been other works as well, but I'm generalizing by and large. They're often, I will actually supply instances of how this is being done. They are often unwilling to make use of the new researches and emergent revisionist histories being carried out by their counterparts among social scientists, be they Marxists, subalternists, or cultural studies scholars. Rather than being an exclusive or a textual study of the poets individually or as a group, I try here to focus on the narrativization of the history of early Indian English poetry. The pattern I have already described begins to emerge gradually after Indian English poets develop some self-confidence between 1950 and 1970, following the international success of a few poets like Nissim Ezekiel and A.K. Ramanujan. Soon after, many others follow, namely Kamala Das, Arun Kalatkar, R. Parthasarthi, Jayanta Mahapatra, Dilip Chitre, and Keki and Darwala, to name just a few. Not a few of these poets were students and teachers of English literature, as we all know. Apart from them, many Indian English academics who had grown up on a diet of lyricism and new criticism began rethinking the field of Indian writing in English. This significant Srinivas Iyengar, C.D. Narasimha, V.K. Gokak, and M.K. Naik. Again, I'm naming only the most prominent ones, who in a way create and fight for the then emergent rubric variously and broadly described as Indo-Anglian literature, Commonwealth literature, and so on and so forth. Many of us would recall how the tussle went on between mainstream English academics and those who wanted Indo-Anglian writing and so on and so forth in the 1960s. Some of you are very young and won't recall this, but others like me would surely recall how this fight happened in different departments of English in India. the narrativization of the field, early Indian English literature in general and Indian English poetry in particular. Srinivas Iyer, in his 1962 volume, Indian Writing in English, and C.D. Narasimhaya in his work, The Swan and the Eagle, 1969, and some others who follow, advance a strong case for the new genre or rubric. Iyengar puts together his lectures delivered on the subject in British universities like Leeds as early as the late 1950s and 1960s, and champions their cause in his pioneering volume. In his path-breaking anthology, The Golden Treasury of Indo-Anglian Poetry, 1970, again brought out by our own Sahitya Akademi, V.K. Gokak begins by saying what would be said often in future. And I quote Gokak, Indo-Anglian poetry was born under a romantic star, unquote. P. Lal dismisses Aurobindo Ghosh's poetry as, and this is the phrase I'm quoting from P. Lal, greasy and weak, while hailing the new breed of poets. C.D. Narasimhaya refers to Derosio's poetry as, and again I'm quoting reproducing the phrase, fragile romanticism. Of Sarojini Naidu, he similarly complains endlessly. Like C.D. Narasimhaya, Paul Varghese complains of both the romanticism and patriotism of Derosio. By now, the new breed of poets had themselves taken over the task of projecting the genre in the second half of the 20th century, after decades of self-doubt and guilt for having tied their tongue to foreign chains. They also felt the need for a backward glance at their predecessors, thanks to the criticism that they themselves faced vis-a-vis Bhasa writers. And we all know how many Bengali as well as other poets, writers who wrote in their own languages had a problem with Indian writing in English. So these authors had to defend themselves. Now, by the 1970s or so, they are a little more confident, and they are trying to knit together a whole tradition in which they figure. The issue of Indianness and so on and so forth, demanding the tracing of a genealogy of the genre or the rubric. Among the major anthologies, P. Lal, V.K. Gokak, R. Parthasarathi, K.K. Daruwala, and A.K. Mehrotra either refused to recognize or made condescending remarks on the 19th century poets as their predecessors. Salim Piradina says, and I quote, Nissim Ezekiel is the first important Indian poet, unquote. Parthasarathi claimed that Indian English poetry, and I quote Parthasarathi, did not seriously begin to exist till after the withdrawal of the British from India. That is after 1947. So they completely discount whatever had gone before. In his anthology, in his own anthology, K.K. Daruwala, while introducing the poetry of the previous 2 decades, that is 1960 to 1980, begins by saying quite predictably that, and I quote Daruwala, to an extent, the earlier Indian poetry was a victim of prevailing literary fashions, and then he lumps together the poetry of an entire century or more, from 1820s to the 1920s. I'm talking about K.K. Daruwala. Derosio, he said, had more talent, but circumlocution managed to snuff out whatever little spark there was in his poems. So Derosio is gone. A.K. Mehrotra says, and I quote again, Henry Derosio, Toru Dutt, Aurobindo Ghosh, and Sarojini Naidu were courageous and perhaps charming men and women, but not those with whom you could today do business. I don't know what business, what he meant by doing business with these poets. This is A.K. Mehrotra. As I have demonstrated elsewhere, not here, but elsewhere, poets like Ezekiel, but especially Ezekiel, were heavily indebted to modernists like Yeats, Eliot, Pound, and William Carlos Williams, among others, and had no understanding of, or very little understanding of, indigenous poetic traditions. And here I am making exceptions. We had Ramanujan, Kolatkar, Jayanta Mahapatra, and Dilip Chitre, who knew their own, traditions in their respective languages. But many of the other writers who wrote in English in the 1970s, 80s had no clue as to what was going on in their own languages for the previous 400 years. So they were completely dependent on the models that were provided to them by the European poets. It was only to be expected that most of them should deride and overlook their ancestors, such as Derozio and the Derozios and the Dutch. If the modernists had attacked romantics and Victorians, we all remember as scholars of English modernism or Anglo-American modernism, how T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and many others routinely demolished the romantic tradition and certainly the Victorians. So if the English modernists attacked the romantics and Victorians, can the Indian English poets be far behind? How could Derozio's poetry, which was imitative of the romantics, be any better? This was good enough reason for them to discard the Derozios, Dutch, Sarojini Naidus, and so on. Almost inevitably, Daruwala says, and I quote, "Unfortunately, in this century, the Indian muse fell willy-nilly into the hands of those who were either involved in the freedom struggle or were in the forefront of religious revivalism." I unquote. He goes on further, again a quotation from Daruwala: "The older poets wrote like English poets and as a result failed to establish an indigenous tradition of writing English. A clean break had to be made with the past." So they are creating an image of themselves as moderns. Aesthetic criteria and critical analytical tools being thus imprecise enough, even vaguer ones were invoked. For example, profundity. Without any definition, without any critical analysis provided to the reader, the term profundity was bandied about. Profundity is as difficult to ascertain as was the pre-modernist notion of the poetic. Daruwala finds fault with Toru Dutt and G.C. Dutt, saying they could hardly ever treat a subject with profundity. Then he stops, leaves it to us to understand what he means. Of course, one notices this in one of the best known poems by Derozio. This has been quoted already, The Harp of India. "Why hangest thou lonely on yon withered bough, unstrung forever," etc., etc. So naturally, this was very easy target for the late 20th century Indian English poets. So if I have the whole sonnet with me. I'm not reproducing it. I'm sure people are familiar with this sonnet. With all its stock romantic ingredients of apostrophe, nostalgia for the past, imagery of harp and all, some of these images Indian readers should be strangers to. Aside from the linguistic conventions of thou and so on, complete with archaisms, is a far cry from traditional Indian poetry. Imagine the kind of poetry that was being written. Though there was a presentation today about osmosis, I don't think any poet in Telugu or Odia wrote along these lines using this kind of language around the middle of the 19th century. This is very different, highly derivative. But the question is, the poet, anthologists, literary historians who berate the earliest poets in question are loath to be self-critically aware that they themselves stood in relation to the moderns exactly in the same way as the early Indian English poets stood in relation to the romantics. And the latter generation of their predecessors, say Naidu, Tagore, Aurobindo, and so on. Many of the poets of his generation that Daruwala includes in his selection can be demonstrated as having fallen victim to quote-unquote prevailing literary fashions. The following example culled from Keki Daruwala's anthology will suffice, and this is, I think, a few lines from Dilip Chitre. I'm quoting a poem, a few lines from Dilip Chitre's poem. "The door I was afraid to open was autumn, one luminous month of remembering nothing, the dark smell of rotting leaves in her voice, while the sensuous shadows of trees burnt, blah, blah, blah." Now, any one of us, all of us familiar with T.S. Eliot's Wasteland and many of his other poems will recognize and even four quarters, the door that doesn't open, etc., etc. Burnt Norton, for example. So what I'm trying to say, there are many other examples which I have called, but I'm not, for shortage of time, I'm not going to reproduce them. What I'm trying to say is that many of these poets who thought they had modernized themselves and who had moved away from the earlier tradition are actually falling prey to the same kind of derivative aesthetic which they get from Anglo-American modernism and sometimes, continental modernism as well. These lines are full of echoes of Eliot and of some images like F.S. Flint as the poet of Derozio, Kasi Prasad Ghosh, or Tarudat was redolent of the late 18th and early 19th century English poets, or even of Milton and Shakespeare. When the late 20th century poets look back on the corpus of poetry, they do so from within their own framework. Even Eunice D'Souza, in her very recent introduction that I have already quoted from, she begins by admitting that until recently, she too subscribed to this same judgment. Her favorite poem is Dhan Gopal Mukherjee's In Bedlam. This is 1922, the year in which The Wasteland was published. And then Eunice D'Souza praises this. But the most extravagant praise he can grant it is that one of the moods of modernism finds its first expression in it. So this is a telltale sign of how the same poets who are writing modern Indian English poetry are committing the same mistake, if at all you can call it a mistake, that the early Indian English poets had made, according to them, not according to me personally, but the judgment they had come up with. It can be, the same charge can be leveled against them. Now I'm concluding with these two sentences, the 2 points that I tried to make here. As I said, this is a very this is an abridged version. I have some other theoretic, but for shortage of time, I'm concluding this by saying that I'm making 2 points here. One is that the poet critics who are critical of the early Indian English poets because of the derivative nature of their poetry do so under the influence of the new modernist aesthetic imbibed from abroad due to their own location in departments of English. Many of them are English professors. Secondly, even while doing so, they themselves tend to be derivative vis-a-vis the European modernist poets. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Satpathy. That indeed was an eye-opener as to a comparative assessment between the new and the old. And I think we began with the old and we are now heading towards the new. So this indeed, traces the whole generation shift of ideology. Now, can we open the session up for questions? Yes, please.
You can discuss among yourself. Yeah.
Yes. Any questions coming from the panelists themselves?
Nobody is raising the hands. Okay. So
I have a question for Gagi Talapatra about the cultural osmosis. Though in your paper, Gagi, you talked about the interface between the Indian poets and the Indian English poets. I don't think you actually highlighted any specific instances. So it would be good if you can highlight a couple of instances.
Yes. It was a very general paper, as I did mention just before Professor Radha Chakravarti's paper. So that would be interesting to see the instances of the osmosis.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that question. And since I was focusing on early Indian English literature and not really, within that frame of 15 minutes time, I was just looking at a general building up of the idea and how the distant got more concretized, and how it was not just about following literary conventions of a European language, but gradual, by osmosis, I meant a gradual penetration of elements which were completely Indian, or thoughts which were Indian, English moving away from the domains of being an imposed language to an acquired language, from an imposed language to an acquired language. Incidentally, while reading about this 19th century Indian literatures and 19th century Indian English literature, there were works such as, there is this one work which comes to my mind instantly, Kavi Ani Kavita. Kavi Ani Kavita, it is written in Gujarati, and we have, I forget the name of the writer, but it is a late 19th century work, which deals with the components of poetry and how the relationship between the poet and poetry is to be assessed. And here we have the poet, the writer, Kavi Ani Kavita, talking about how poetry is pleasure, but also how poetry is imitation. So we have an amalgamation of a European influence of ideas infiltrating, where we find the Aristotelian concept of mimesis also there in the form of imitation, while there is also a mention of how poetry is intended for the pleasure of common man and should be written in spontaneous language, reiterating the Wordsworthian ideal. So what I was trying to say is that the writers, several writers at this point of time, they themselves become channels of, confluence of the literary traditions, the literary conventions established in English, as well as their own literatures, shaping and assimilating the influences, sometimes into their own language, and sometimes the development of the idea into their work, which traces a gradual evolution of thoughts when we look at 19th century English literature. I was trying to just provide a brief overview according to my understanding of it. So these are the things which I was trying to convey.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Alkaji.
Not a question, just a request. The 3 stories that I took up in Teen Sangi,
Yes.
it would be a pleasure to see, and since it was presenting on the Sahitya Akademi platform, a request, if you could have a translated version of it, which would help us to understand the, the psyche towards the later years of Rabindranath Tagore. What did he have in mind? But once the translation is there, I think
Radha Chakravati. Yeah. Professor Radha Chakravati, unmute yourself and please.
Yes.
I think this question of translation is very important. As I was listening to you, I actually wanted to say that Laboratory has been translated and is available in English.
Yes, it has.
So it is not that none of these stories are available, but I think what you're saying signals very importantly, the continued need for translations and,
Absolutely.
as a form of continued access, so that we can rethink Tagore, so that we can reconnect him with what's going on in the literary scenario today.
Yes.
And for that, his total oeuvre has certainly not been exhausted when it comes to translations. Even now, only a fraction of his work is available in English.
Yes.
So thank you for signaling that, because as I was listening to the discussions, I just felt that somewhere this whole question of osmosis and this whole question of cultural confluences, all of that, the place of translation in all of this perhaps needs to be kept in mind as perhaps not just a question of literary historicization and the role that translation has played historically. And here I'm thinking of the translation of Gitanjali and how that placed Tagore on the world stage, and how that placed Indian writing and South Asian writing on the world stage. But as a future roadmap, I think, for evolving dialogues across different Indian languages in our literary traditions as well.
Yes.
Professor Rajul, just we have 3 minutes, 4 minutes left. I mean, very interesting to know. It will be very interesting to know the views of Sumanyu Satpathy, Professor. I mean, from what Gargi has, responded, how Gargi has responded, maybe, notwithstanding um, somebody like Keki's description of Sri Aurobindo as greedy, religious frat, all those things. But there are a couple of works, just to say two works like Cultural Renaissance of India or Life Divine. In fact, I was expecting that more people will touch upon Sri Aurobindo in today's, anyway, no problem.
Yes, he
Now
was
that,
missing.
it was
Sadly,
mentioned, but So, but Professor Sumanyu, what do you think? Those are like, they are neither greasy nor religious nor independent, related to independent movement, like Cultural Renaissance of India, Life Divine, those works. I feel that he is one of the most neglected, ignored English writer of India.
Shri Aurobindo.
I think Professor Manu is not there. So please conclude.
I'm there.
Yeah, please, sir. I very interesting.
Unlike what is being made out of Aurobindo's work, I was doing some research on the Criterion, which was edited by T.S. Eliot. And in 1926 or 27, there was a long discussion of Savitri. Savitri attracted the imagination of the Western reader in a big way. And I do not see any discussion of Sri Aurobindo's Savitri in the Indian context, which is actually, the works of, the problem with Sri Aurobindo's works, pardon my saying so, a large majority of critical works on Sri Aurobindo is done by his devotees or people who believe in his philosophy. Because of that, the kind of objective, or what we call objective criticism, is conspicuous by its absence. So a proper evaluation of Aurobindo's work has not been possible in India, or it has not been undertaken, I cannot say. But if I were to talk about Aurobindo's work, his poetry, his drama especially, is very rich, and I feel that it's crying out for a proper analysis by serious-minded academics who can actually look at the large body of work by Aurobindo with some theoretical, well-informed theoretical and methodological rigor. So that, I think, would do a lot of wonderful things to Aurobindo's reputation.
Thank you.
What do you say, Rajmohanji?
Hello. Can we be heard? Can we be heard?
I think Rajmohanji is muted or something. There's some problem.
Okay.
Okay.
I think there is a loss of connection. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, you please conclude, Professor Raju.
Yes. I think as the first in the series, we have had a chronological development of Indian English writing. I agree with Sahitya Akademi's intervention that there should have been, and I think we are ready for the next series, therefore, that some of the texts that have not been looked at need more intensive, kind of an analysis. We've had Tagore today dominating the scene. We've had Rajmohan's wife and some of the early poetry, but some texts have not been looked at. Some genres have not been looked at. For example, the early Indian autobiographies have not been looked at. Also, what has not been looked at are the theatrical dimensions of how that has contributed to the emergence of the literature that we have now. But all in all, I think it was a very comprehensive overview of literature, overview of the ideas that have disseminated from there, the osmotic pressures that have come up, the whole idea of how the nation has been represented through the writing. This is very important to my mind, but rather than look at it panoptically, I think what we need to do is to look at it with a more, deconstructive perspective. So thank you, all the speakers, and we would want another in the series of early Indian writing in English. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Radha Chakravati, Professor Sumanyu, Professor Alka, Professor Gai, and Professor Saptarishi. Thank you very much.